He teaches European history, world history, and the history of science and medicine at the University of Prince Edward Island. His research has received an abundance of funding over time, including ongoing support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. All of this has contributed to a remarkably productive research career, which includes authorship of numerous books, including Inheriting Madness, Professionalization and Psychiatric Knowledge in the 19th Century France, Keeping America Sane, Psychiatry and Eugenics in the US and Canada, Suspicious Minds, The Triumph of Paranoia in Everyday Life, and most recently, A Merciful End, The Euthanasia Movement in Modern America. This morning, Dr. Dowbiggin will consider the question of reason to panic, in which he will address the history of anxiety disorders and its implications for the overall social fabric in the 21st century. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the very kind introduction. I'm told I have 20 minutes, and I've got a PowerPoint presentation to get through, so I hope it isn't a little disorienting for the audience. Well, let me just begin by saying I have no conflict of interest with a direct bearing on the matter that I'm going to discuss today. And what I'd like to really talk about this morning is what I think is, according to studies, one of the most formidable public health challenges facing not just Canada, but the entire world in the 21st century. And that is the staggering rise in the incidence of people reporting symptoms of anxiety. And what I'd like to finish with are just a few questions that I hope would inform our present-day debate regarding policy and how we can somehow stem this, well, in fact, an epidemic of anxiety. So let me just begin by saying some introductory things about anxiety. It's a symptom in most psychiatric illnesses. It frequently coincides with depression. But I think the key statistic here is that in 2002, the World Health Survey reported that anxiety was the most prevalent mental health problem around the globe. And I think what's of particular interest to us in this day and age is that the incidence among adolescents and children suffering from anxiety is growing, again, at a staggering rate. About 13 of every 100 children and adolescents aged 9 to 17 experience some kind of anxiety disorder. Females tend to be more affected than males. And 3 million Canadians now report suffering from SAD or social anxiety disorder, which the pharmaceutical industry, interestingly enough, is defined as or calls being allergic to people, social anxiety disorder. Now, besides the suffering that people suffering from anxiety have to deal with in their daily lives, and of course their families too, I think from a policy perspective, an important point is that the soaring drug costs for healthcare plans make the history of anxiety one of the most important issues facing policymakers in government, industry, and medicine today. And anxiety disorders in young people now studies are showing are precursors to psychiatric disorders later in adolescence and in adulthood. So a better understanding of adolescent anxiety can be a major step forward in overall preventive mental health care. Okay, and a few historical reflections. There's been a striking rise in the diagnosis of anxiety-related disorders since the late 19th century, and this rise in anxiety diagnosis has really gathered striking momentum since World War II, so that anxiety is becoming a global public health challenge in the 21st century. I'm going to argue this morning that anxiety is a result of both an illness-breeding society and an illness-affirming culture, and I'll explain what I mean a little bit more as we go along. Another point I'd like to make is the crippling effects of anxiety are linked to gender. And again, to end on the question, well, what can history teach us about this particular public health problem? Now, as far as the history of the anxiety diagnosis goes, before World War II, just let me make some general comments. Anxiety has always been with us, so it's not anything totally new or unique. Reports of acute shyness and stage fright, which are symptoms of anxiety disorders, date back as far as classical antiquity. Before the modern age, the majority view was that most anxiety was actually normal and even an asset in certain situations that called for vigilance. And in cultures around the world that prize bashfulness as a mark of modesty, shyness was widely praised in women and young men. The first crack in this consensus, however, appeared in the so-called Age of Progress of the late 19th century, when starvation, epidemics, high rates of infant and maternal mortality were declining in severity. An interesting coincidence. So that we see anorexia nervosa first described in 1873, agoraphobia, dread of public places, first identified in 1876. And here's a tongue twister for you, dysmorphophobia, which is the fear of being deformed and the forerunner of what's today called body dysmorphic disorder. This was coined in 1891. For the next few decades, this fellow, Sigmund Freud, and his theories held sway, and as a result, anxiety was normally defined as a neurotic reaction to underlying factors. There was less emphasis on the actual symptoms of anxiety, and emphasis was on treatment and counseling to deal with, from a psychoanalytic perspective or Freudian perspective. So in a sense, anxiety wasn't a hot topic. But once World War II came along, it proved to be a major watershed in the social history of anxiety. Opinion makers around the world began talking about living in a world, an age of anxiety. There's the factor of language. And by the way, one thing I haven't mentioned up to this point is that when you explain anything in historical context, you have to rely on what I would call a multifactorial explanation. In other words, there are many different factors, many different causes that help to explain what we're talking about this morning. And so certainly one is the factor of language. Hans Selye's concept of stress, which became very important for people, for patients trying to explain why it is that they feel anxious. Well, I'm stressed. I'm prone to stress, meaning external stimuli. It wasn't exactly, incidentally, what Seyle meant by the notion of stress, but that's another issue. There's, of course, the impact of the media, which elevates, I would argue, anxiety levels by teaching millions that they live in a world of grim uncertainty, diminishing natural resources, deadly ethnic violence, and other things such as that. And, of course, in our day and age, we've seen 9/11 and the Madrid and London bombings, which heightens levels of anxiety. There's also the factor of what the Toronto writer Patricia Pearson calls the culture of Hucksterism. And by this, she's referring to the widespread symptoms of anxiety due to a culture that she argues celebrates fierce winner-take-all competition on campuses, in government, in the media, and throughout the corporate world. And this is her book, if any of you are interested. It's an autobiographical account of a Toronto woman, prize-winning author, who has dealt with her own symptoms of anxiety. Then, of course, we have TV shows, Survivor, American Idol, those kinds of programs. The message, Pearson argues anyway, is that there's no shame in shamelessness, and there's a premium on grabbing all the attention we can get, so that fears of acute failure in countless people who find it difficult to emulate the Donald Trumps of the world. There's the factor of conspiracism, term coined by the American author Daniel Pipes, and it's attributable to worries about terrorism, which again heighten levels of anxiety and intensify pre-existing beliefs that history can be reduced to clandestine plotting by powerful people or organizations. Conspiracism feeds paranoia, which experts say next to fear is the most communicable mentality. And here too, the role of the news media and digital technology has proven to be crucial. They leave countless people feeling vulnerable and suspicious. Other forms of technology, emailing, texting, Facebook, and so on, cyberbullying, sexual predators, we all know these lists. This was the book, one of the books that Catherine was referring to, which I've written about on paranoia. Another breakthrough after World War II was the introduction of tranks or tranquilizers to mood, or as a form of mood medicine. And this draws attention to the role of what I would call, or what experts call, big pharma, the pharmaceutical industry. So the tranquilizers like Miltown and Valium, which were introduced in the 1950s and 60s, gave way to the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors of the 1980s. Some of you are familiar with some of these names, like Prozac and so on. And this has led to overprescription due to mass advertising and popular demand. This is a fellow by the name of Peter Kramer, whose book some of you may have read, Listening to Prozac, in which he popularized Prozac, not again as a drug to take to just allay your anxiety, but as a drug that actually helps you feel better than well. And so you can see how that kind of an approach to psychiatric medication makes the medication even more popular. So there have been development of new drugs influencing the official recognition of psychiatric disease categories. The watershed for psychiatric classification as far as anxiety was concerned came in 1980 when anxiety was separated from depression. Up to that point, it had been classified simply as a symptom or as a subset of depression. And in 1980, the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of American Psychiatry, the third edition, classified anxiety as a discrete, separate mental disorder unto itself with its own subsets. So depression and anxiety separated. Post-traumatic stress disorder was recognized in 1980, another anxiety-related disorder. And anxiety was subdivided into social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and panic disorder. We don't have time to go over all of them, but that'll give you a sense of the explosion of interest in anxiety from a professional perspective. Then there's the factor of the politics of reimbursement. An official diagnosis makes a patient eligible for third-party reimbursement, normally for pharmaceutical treatment. And insiders joke that if you can get your diagnosis recognized in the DSM, it's as good as an insurance claim, okay? And this helps to drive diagnoses such as post-traumatic stress disorder, which of course initially was linked to the experiences of Vietnam War veterans, which draws attention to the influence of politics on the history of anxiety diagnosis. So that estimates, and it was anti-Vietnam War groups that lobbied in the 1970s for the recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder, which was recognized in 1980 officially. Estimates in 1982 pegged the incidence of PTSD at 500 to 700,000 Vietnam War veterans, most of whom, interestingly enough, had never served in actual combat. Nonetheless, they were diagnosed officially with PTSD and were receiving reimbursement. So in 2004, 216,000 U.S. veterans were receiving disability benefits. And then an interesting thing happened. The women's movement appropriated the PTSD diagnosis, so much so that Harvard professor Judith Lewis Herman announced in 1992, most common PTSD disorders are those not of men in war, but of women in civilian life, and particularly married women, women in abusive relationships. This leads to what I would call the culture of victimization, another factor which helps to explain how it is our culture is a kind of culture breeding factor in explaining the rise in anxiety. So PTSD is an excellent example of how the rise of anxiety is linked to the emergence of what I would call the self-help and recovery movement, SHRM. And this fits in with the standard interpretation of PTSD because it says its sufferers are victims twice over. Victims at the hands of original perpetrators and an indifferent society that disregards their pain. So SHRM stresses vulnerability, powerlessness, victimization, and authenticity. And I think many of us in this room, when we think about it, realize that how this movement has pervaded our culture, from our schools to our offices to our hospitals and even to our homes. And of course, an important, I would argue, factor in explaining the rise of the victimization and self-help and recovery movement are TV shows, daytime TV shows, including OPRAH, who I understand is shortly going off the air. The net effect, the old ethic of self-reliance, mental toughness, and stoicism declines, and millions are led to believe they are sicker than they know, pay an enormous emotional price just to survive, and are not to blame for their conditions. They need only seek professional help to enjoy a much higher sense of self-esteem and self-worth. And this has led to what some observers have argued is a culture of narcissism. And another factor which the sociologist Frank Furaday refers to as cultural scripting. And what he means by this is he means the self-help and recovery movement has normalized fear, and it provides people with socially approved rules about what their feelings mean. And it leads to a kind of, well, a sense of entitlement to an anxiety diagnosis, making it acceptable, especially for highly stressed people, to adopt sick roles rather than rely on their own willpower. And some patients come to cherish their diagnosis of anxiety. Some, of course, not all, and perhaps not even the majority. And now we come to the factor of gender, which I wish I had more time to spend on, but I'll try and cover it as quickly as I can. So when it comes to women, the status of women in society today, and particularly adolescent females, I see the convergence of the illness breeding and illness affirming aspects of today's society particularly evident. Illness breeding, well, governments, media, Hollywood, lobbyists tell women that they can have it all. The gender is no obstacle to women's success in the academic, corporate, entertainment, and government worlds. And that this message sometimes, often, founders on the shoals of everyday reality. This places an enormous pressure on women, including adolescent girls. And it creates a sharp contrast between the cultural ideals and everyday reality, intensifying anxiety. And so it becomes a kind of illness-affirming process in which, as some historians argue, people, in this case young adolescent girls, women, succumb to a kind of flight into illness. Interestingly enough, the pharmaceutical industry has jumped on board and it's run advertisements claiming that Prozac is actually a kind of feminist drug and enables you to have it all, to be a career woman, to have a family, to do everything. And of course, if you feel anxiety, then there is Prozac to rely on. So conclusions. The rise of the anxiety disorder, I would argue, is one of the most remarkable events in the history of medicine. Its rise is due to, again, what I would argue, a perfect storm of social, medical, and biological circumstances, an interplay of scientific theory and cultural values. The modern day, though, is not unique. It's in many ways no different than past eras. Certain attitudes, behaviors, and emotions become defined as medically correct. And social factors have helped to create a cultural environment which bestows a kind of legitimacy on the pool of anxiety-related symptoms. So in a sense, it becomes acceptable, in a way, to be anxious, becomes acceptable to suffer from anxiety symptoms. And the contents of the symptom pool are in a virtually perpetual state of negotiation, historically anyway, among various stakeholders, opinion makers, and vested interest groups who try to bend and shape the evolution of the psychiatric diagnoses in response to the twists and turns of history. So as a result, and this is no surprise to those of us in history of medicine, some diagnoses rise and some fall over time. It's just the nature of history. The rise and the fall of diagnoses such as anxiety sometimes defy the best evidence. And given all these factors, I would argue it's difficult to foresee the anxiety diagnosis declining anytime soon, especially adolescent anxiety. It's probably going to rise before it starts falling again. Lessons of history. Well, I don't think there are really any lessons of history. But I think that history can certainly inform, as I said earlier, our approach to grappling with this formidable public health challenge. Anxiety is at once real and historically rooted. I don't want to suggest in any way, shape, or form this morning that by taking an historical perspective, that the pain that people who are anxious feel is illegitimate. It's not real. It is real, of course. So it's the suffering that goes on when you suffer from anxiety is very real, but it's both real and historically rooted. Anxiety's expressions, worry, panic, fear, do exist, and they are part of being human. But the descriptions, the interpretations, and the treatments of anxiety have varied according to time and place. So history shows that the dividing line between the problems of living, and I think this is a crucial point, the dividing line between problems of living and genuine disorder is often blurred. Nonetheless, today we face the unprecedented situation, the recent emergence of a therapeutic illness-affirming culture. And this is what's historically unique about our era. Obviously, in past eras, our grandparents, if they felt anxious, were told to suck it up, right? Deal with it yourself. Tell it to the Marines, right? Today, I would argue, and I think most of us in this room would agree, it's very different. So the growing clinical interest in adolescent psychiatry is an excellent opportunity then to engage in a debate over what is in fact the threshold of emotional pain. And I think the key is for all stakeholders and vested interest groups, ranging from patients and families right through to the various medical professions, psychology, counseling, the pharmaceutical industry, patients groups, and so on. The key is for all these groups to engage in a deep dialogue about the distinctions between these problems of living and real disorders. Let me leave you with 3 questions. Are we transforming teenage angst into an illness? How do we roll back the illness-affirming culture without sacrificing non-judgmentalism? I think this is crucial. We can't deal with folks suffering from anxiety if we are judgmental. And so non-judgmentalism has to be a part of our clinical approach. And finally, how do we change our culture without blaming the patient? So thank you very much.